Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster. When the Public Policy Committee met in May to plan Revision N of Minnesota Atheists' public policy document, one assignment was obvious and immediately agreed. August Berkshire would write a new policy opposing religious exemptions to municipal noise abatement regulations. In Minneapolis, a mosque was granted such an exemption to play an amplified call to prayer several times each day during Ramadan. It was so loud that it constituted an intrusive disruption of the lives of non-Muslims living in the neighborhood. It had become a national issue because August had reported it to the Freedom from Religion Foundation as a state church separation issue. Without question, the job of drafting our policy was in August's hands. I had a few issues that I was eager to take on. First was an egregious case of government entanglement of religion through direct financial support. In response to the devastation resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, Congress passed an economic bailout called the Paycheck Protection Plan, or PPP. It was a $2.2 trillion program of loans and grants intended to protect the employment of workers in small businesses. The program was to be administered by the Small Business Administration, which had regulations against paying grants or loans to churches. But during the period for public comment, the Trump administration announced the PPP would be exempted from those regulations. The program paid $7.3 billion to churches. A major case that was before the Supreme Court at the time involved the Bladensburg Cross in Pennsylvania, a huge monument that dominates the scene, maintained at government expense. It was feared that with this case, the court would change the standards that stood for decades of when religious symbols on government property violate the Establishment Clause. We were opposed, and I accepted the editing duty. Another issue was the creeping growth of the interpretation of RLUIPA, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. It had conferred to prisoners religious rights that overruled the rights of prison management to maintain safety. The case Fox v. Washington involved prisoners who were denied the right to form a Christian nationalist congregation with explicitly racial tenets. The prison ruled that it had a high likelihood of inciting racial violence, but the court ignored these practical concerns. The last issue that I claimed was an insertion into our end-of-life policy. Minnesota had had a bill in the legislature, the End-of-Life Options Act, that never emerged from committee. We had to state Minnesota Atheists' hope that the bill would be reintroduced into the next legislature and passed. There were a few more items. Georgia Hancock stepped up to volunteer for all of them. American Atheists had issued a state-by-state survey of the legislative commitment to secular government that we felt was so important that we had to acknowledge it. So how would we do this? Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had formed a commission on unalienable rights that was to focus foreign policy objectives on U.S. support for God-given rights that are unalienable, while distinguishing them from rights that are merely legislated. I'll have more to say about this later. There were a couple of issues that were specific to coping with the pandemic lockdown. One is that religions are claiming that they have a constitutional exemption to regulations restricting the size of public gatherings. The other is they're demanding that there be a ban on elective medical procedures to preserve medical resources for treating the pandemic, that they must include a ban on abortions. Now, with respect to Toastmasters, a requirement of my high-performance leadership project is a 360-degree review. I sent these surveys to my committee colleagues and one to the board of the authorizing organization, the Board of Minnesota Atheists. Here is a representative selection of the response I received. Board Secretary Heather Hagee said George is very dependable to lead this effort every year, get proposed revisions to the board in a timely manner, and follow through by making sure any questions are answered and to see that it indeed is reviewed and voted on. Team member August Berkshire had quite a few comments. He wrote, we deal with complex issues and he helps make them understandable as well as making clear our assignments. He is great at following through on what he says he will do. He has well-prepared outlines of how best to handle our tasks. As committee chair, he has an excellent overview of the project, informs committee members of the issues, solicits input, organizes tasks, incorporates changes, and reports to the board of directors. He has no ego in the project and willingly accepts improvements. He offers helpful improved wording for others' writing. He sets the example that no criticism is personal and that our mutual goal is a good end product. He helps others who are struggling with their schedules or assignments. He's totally upfront, honest, and approachable. He praises good work by others. Our committee's task is to draft public policies. There are many categories and subdivisions, and he is especially good at figuring out where policies belong within what is now a lengthy document. More than anyone else in the organization, he realizes the importance of having public policies. He's the leader of an important but tedious and fairly thankless task. He's proactive every year in reminding us that it's time to reconvene. He sends us an outlined and appropriate documents in advance of a meeting. At the end of the meeting, he summarizes the new action items and also reminds us by email. The third 360-degree evaluation I got was from team member and board director at large member, Georgia Hancock. She wrote, George has a clear agenda and time frame for completing the edits and additions. He asks for feedback from the board before moving forward with items that might not fit into the organization's public policy. He consistently provides feedback. He does an excellent job of keeping us on task and has an agenda for every meeting. Georgia rated me as excels on every attribute but one. Only on the question, is willing to change his or her position when presented with compelling information. She downgraded me to accomplished. I think I understand why. When we originally examined new issues for inclusions in Revision N, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had formed an advisory group he named the Council on Unalienable Rights. Pompeo said the commission was formed to focus U.S. foreign policy on promoting human rights, but several secularist groups drew ominous conclusions based on the focus on unalienable rights. Unalienable because they're supposedly God-given. They interpreted that focus to mean that U.S. foreign policy would ignore or denigrate human rights they did not consider unalienable, such as reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights. Georgia wrote a new policy based on the writings of these secularist groups. But the week before we were going to do a reading of Georgia's document, Pompeo's commission released its report. Indeed, it did make the distinction between God-given rights and legislative rights, but nowhere did it state an intent to diminish recognition of any human rights. I helped Georgia to look through the entire document for anything we could quote that would justify these fears. Now, I would not be at all surprised if Pompeo does in fact use the commission document to justify opposing abortion, contraception, and same-sex marriage. But it was carefully written so that that intent is deniable. I suggested we put the policy into a tickle file for revision P to use if those fears were realized. But I pointed out, if Trump loses this year's election, we'll never hear about the commission and its report again. We agreed to do this, which meant the work Georgia had put into writing the policy was wasted. Still, I think we reached the proper conclusion. Revision N was accepted by the board without changes. It was a successful project because the team understood the work to be done. I appreciate their kind words and my leadership, which I think was developed over years of working on this project and staying abreast throughout the year on developments in church-state separation. Mr. Toastmaster.